The story begins as the main character ventured deeper into the dungeon, stepping over the corpses of slain monsters that littered the floor. His expression remained cold and unbothered, illuminated faintly by the dim light that flickered through the damp stone walls. As he moved forward, a faint glow revealed a new chamber ahead. At the center of that room stood a monster, motionless yet emanating a suffocating aura of menace. The light slowly fell upon his face, and his eyes narrowed as he assessed the creature. It was the crazy mantis, a monster with an SSS danger level, towering and still, its scythe-like arms poised to strike at any second. He was taken aback. An SSS-level threat, something that far surpassed even the Demon Lord, who was only classified as level S. Something was terribly wrong with this labyrinth. Before he could think further, the crazy mantis lunged without warning. The creature's speed was blinding, but the main character moved just as swiftly, dodging the lethal strike by a hair's breadth. In one fluid motion, he raised his gun and pulled the trigger. The report echoed violently through the stone chamber as the bullet ripped through one of the mantis's limbs, severing it cleanly. Without hesitation, he leapt into the air, landing behind the creature and fired again. The monster shrieked, its piercing cry shaking the dungeon walls. It retaliated with a wild swing, but before its attack could connect, another shot rang out, this one far stronger. The impact sent blood spraying through the air, staining the stone floor in a crimson haze. As the echoes of battle faded, memories from another world began to stir within him. Japan. A normal high school life that now felt like a distant illusion. He remembered standing alone in a hallway, cornered by a group of delinquents. At 17, Takeda Junpei found himself trapped once again in a familiar nightmare. Kido Shoyuta, the leader of the group, towered over him, demanding money that Junpei didn't have. The sneer on Kido's face deepened as he mocked Junpei's trembling voice. Without warning, Kido drove his foot into Junpei's stomach, knocking the breath from his lungs. The others laughed cruelly as he fell to his knees. Their fists followed soon after, blows landing without mercy, leaving bruises that blended into the ones from the day before. This was Takeda Junpei's everyday life, a cycle of humiliation and pain that never seemed to end. No matter how much he wished for a quiet, ordinary second year of high school, reality refused him even that small kindness. Then, a voice broke through the jeers. A girl's voice, strong and steady. Tatsumiya Noriko stood nearby, her sharp gaze fixed on the scene before her. The bullies faltered slightly, irritated by her interference. Junpei averted his eyes, unable to meet her gaze, shame burning through him. The boys mocked her, calling her his wife, sneering at her attempts to protect him. But Noriko ignored them, stepping forward with quiet determination. She grabbed Junpei's arm, urging him away from the group as their laughter trailed behind them. As they walked down the hall, silence hung between them. Junpei finally spoke, insisting she shouldn't get involved, that it wasn't her problem. But Noriko shook her head. She reminded him that years ago, he had once stood up for her when she was the one being bullied. Because of that, she couldn't simply turn away now. She told him that she knew he was stronger than he believed, that beneath all the pain and humiliation, there was still courage in him. Even if the whole world turned against him, she wouldn't. And with quiet conviction, she promised that they would bear the burden together. Junpei stood in stunned silence, unable to find words after hearing her. For a long moment, the world seemed to quiet around him. Then, slowly, his thoughts began to form. He realized that nothing in his life would ever change unless he changed himself first. Even if it was just a small step, he had to do it, for Noriko's sake. Determination began to rise within him, but his moment of resolve was shattered when a familiar, harsh voice called out from behind. Kido's voice cut through the air like a blade. He was demanding again, his money today. Junpei froze, tension gripping his body. But before either of them could react further, something strange happened. The air itself trembled, and the space around them began to twist. The world bent unnaturally. Colors bled into each other. The hallway stretched and folded in ways that defied reason. Both Kido and Junpei gasped as their surroundings melted away into a swirl of distortion. A sharp dizziness overtook them, and Junpei's thoughts screamed in panic. What is this? His vision blurred completely, then faded into black. When his eyes opened again, everything was different. The familiar school hallway was gone. In its place stood a strange landscape, foreign and unrecognizable. Confusion and fear painted every face. No one could understand what had just happened, or where they were. Then, a calm voice echoed from ahead. Someone said that he would explain the situation. They all turned toward the source. A boy stood there, smiling faintly, his presence somehow overpowering despite his youthful appearance. Everyone froze, disbelief plastered on their faces. Kido's expression twisted with fear and anger. Sweat rolled down his temple as he shouted, demanding answers. The boy only smirked in amusement. Enraged, Kido charged toward him, screaming and demanding to know where they were. But before he could reach the boy, everything changed again. The boy's calm voice cut through the chaos, saying that he understood Kido's frustration, but that his yelling was annoying. In the same instant, something unseen sliced through the air. Kido's face twisted grotesquely, his skin splitting open. Pain and confusion mixed in his scream before his entire head exploded, blood and fragments spraying across the ground. The others froze, paralyzed by the sudden, horrifying sight. Noriko's eyes widened, her body trembling. Junpei stared blankly at his blood-stained hands, his mind reeling. His trembling fingers touched the warm liquid on his face, blood, pieces of flesh, fragments of bone. The reality of what he was seeing sank in like a nightmare he couldn't wake from. Then, with a casual snap of the boy's fingers, everything reversed. Kido's head reformed before their eyes, the blood vanished, and his gasp filled the air once again. Everyone stood motionless, horror and disbelief battling within them. Kido stammered in confusion, demanding to know what had just happened, what the boy truly was. The boy's expression shifted into a faint smile. He admitted that he hadn't introduced himself yet. Then, with calm authority, he declared that he was the creator of their world, in other words, a god. The word hung heavy in the air. He continued, saying that he was once human too. But that was billions of years ago. Over 3 billion years had passed since he ascended to divinity, though he admitted he had lost count. It had simply been too long. He spoke with an unnerving ease, explaining that even gods had their own troubles. For instance, they could not die. Immortality, he said, was not a blessing, it was a curse of endless existence. To pass the time, they had to find ways to entertain themselves. And so, he explained, out of boredom and endless time, he had decided to create a new form of amusement. This time, it involved them. He would transfer them into another world. A suffocating silence fell over the group. Junpei's mind spun, unable to process the absurdity of it all. No one could speak. How could anyone possibly find words in the presence of something like this? The boy, this so-called god, continued speaking with a serene smile. His world, he said, existed in another dimension. He called it the Beta Fantasy world. In that realm, kings from various nations would perform summoning rituals to call forth heroes of their choosing. He explained that, this time, he had permitted that summoning magic to draw them, Junpei and the others, into that world. Noriko trembled and hesitantly spoke. Her voice was small, filled with confusion. She said they didn't understand any of this. The god paused, listening. Then she pleaded. She told him that they only wanted to live normal lives. That they didn't ask for this. That they wanted to go home. Her voice broke slightly at the end, her desperation echoing in the vast, empty space around them. The god responded sharply, questioning why he would send them home after everything he had already explained. His expression darkened and he said he was bored. Fear crept into Junpei's eyes as he thought to himself that the god's face no longer resembled that of a divine being, it was the face of someone utterly deranged. He noticed that Kido and his group were also beginning to grasp the gravity of the situation. The god then turned his gaze to Junpei and asked if he had understood everything so far. Junpei answered uncertainly. Unbothered, the god continued his explanation. He instructed everyone to look at the glowing status screens before them, telling them that in the world they would soon enter, concepts like levels and ability points were standard. He explained that an average person possessed around 50 HP and 20 AP, and using that as a reference, they could gauge their own value. Kido's eyes widened when he saw his status, then he grinned confidently, realizing how strong he appeared to be. His status window showed his job as a magic warrior, level 1. The god confirmed Kido's strength, praising his skills. Kido turned to his companions, asking about their stats. One replied that his were not as good as Kido's but still decent. Another pointed curiously at the term, Ultra Grade, at the end of their screens. The god explained that this was his gift to them, a bonus skill they would receive once the game began. Ultra Grade, he said, was the highest possible rank for any skill, urging them to use it wisely. Kido then approached Junpei, wanting to see his stats. The moment he looked at Junpei's window, he burst into loud laughter. Grabbing Junpei by the head, he mocked him, laughing even harder as he declared how pathetic it was. His companions rushed over, wanting to see for themselves. Junpei's status displayed. Job, none, level 1. They all laughed uproariously, ridiculing him for having no job, repeating none between their laughter. The god appeared beside Junpei, and remarked that having no job or color meant he was free to learn any skills he desired. However, unlike others, he would need to acquire them by defeating enemies and taking their abilities. Kido frowned slightly, pointing out that, when viewed differently, that could actually be a powerful ability. Junpei silently agreed. The god added that it would indeed be advantageous, but only if Junpei could defeat enemies on his own. He questioned whether Junpei thought he was capable of that, noting that powerful foes with rare abilities were exceedingly rare to begin with. The god's tone shifted as he smirked, saying that an impossible game would be dull. He hinted that there existed a labyrinth filled with abnormal monsters, perhaps even something Junpei might desire. The malice behind his grin filled Junpei with dread. Junpei then turned toward Nariko, who stood motionless and distant. When he called to her, she muttered softly that Kido and the others were treating this like some kind of game. She feared that once they arrived in that other world, it would turn gruesome, perhaps even deadly. Still, she reasoned that with no better options, they would have to rely on Kido. His stats were the highest among them. She urged that they should all do their best together. Junpei said nothing, beads of nervous sweat forming on his face. Without warning, the god's voice boomed once more, announcing their departure. The air around them began to distort and shift as everyone froze in shock. The god, watching them with amusement, thought to himself that the jobless skill hunter, Junpei Takeda, would be interesting to observe. For now, he wished them a safe journey. Like Junpei, Nariko's status window displayed her job as Nun, with the title Villager Girl. The god's voice lingered in Junpei's mind, declaring himself as the creator of the world they inhabited, an existence that transcended everything, a god who would transfer them into another world. Then, faintly within the same echo of memory, came Nariko's gentle voice, soft, reassuring, and warm. She told him that even if everyone else despised him, she never would. Her words had been a small light in that chaos, urging him that they would face it together. The sound of a hoe striking earth snapped Junpei back to reality. The jolt of impact scattered the memories swirling in his head. Someone called his name. Nariko's voice reached him again, this time, not from memory, but from nearby, asking if he had a moment. Junpei replied that he'd be there soon. He thought to himself how long it had been since they first arrived in this world. They had been summoned by the king of the realm, treated as heroes who would stand against the enemies of other nations. At first, the king's expectations were high, but everything ended in failure. Their battles led to defeat after defeat. Eventually, the king grew tired of their worthlessness and cast them aside, banished them from the capital as nothing more than discarded failures. Now they lived in a small, remote village, thrown out like trash to survive on their own. Junpei looked around anxiously. The villagers' eyes were cold, filled with suspicion and contempt. They had arrived during a famine, adding only more mouths to feed. The least they could do, he thought, was to help with the labor. For him, that meant spending each day plowing the fields, trying to earn their place, trying to be useful. He reminded himself he had to change, for Nariko's sake. Then, Nariko's next words struck him like a blow. She mentioned the word sacrifice. Junpei froze, disbelief flooding his face. She smiled faintly, confirming it. She reminded him that the elders had told them when they first came. The famine was caused by a labyrinth nearby, one that demanded sacrifices to keep the calamity contained. Junpei insisted that such matters had nothing to do with them, that was the villagers' concern, not theirs. But Nariko shook her head gently. They were outsiders, yes, but her position among them was the lowest. Her skills, her abilities, everything about her status marked her as useless. The sacrifices, she explained, weren't volunteers. It was simply decided by the elder, and she had been chosen as the most suitable. Her calm acceptance left Junpei speechless. The air between them grew heavy as the truth sank in. She continued, saying that the elder's decision had already been made, there was nothing she could do to refuse. Panic flickered in Junpei's eyes. He told her they should run away, that she didn't have to go through with it. Nariko gently rejected the idea. They had been dispatched to this village under the king's command. If they fled, they would be branded as criminals. In a foreign world where they knew nothing, where would they even run? And if caught, the punishment would not stop with her, it would bring death to all of them. Junpei stood there, wordless, his heart twisting painfully. Nariko smiled softly, as though trying to reassure him. She said it would be all right, that being a sacrifice didn't necessarily mean death. The ritual simply meant being thrown into the labyrinth, a place filled with unknown horrors. But she would survive. She would live, she told him with quiet conviction. Her words made Junpei's blood run cold. His hand trembled, then tightened into a fist. He stared at her and declared that he would not allow it. He would take her place. He would be the sacrifice instead. Nariko's eyes widened in shock. Before she could respond, a faint rustling came from behind them. Both turned quickly toward the sound. From the shadows stepped Kido. Junpei's voice was low, filled with unease as he muttered his name. Kido smirked faintly, saying he'd overheard everything. Junpei reflected silently that Kido had stopped bullying him ever since they arrived in the village. He believed it was because Kido had joined the local vigilante force, which seemed to have curbed his old, violent behavior. Yet lately, Junpei noticed something different. Kido seemed unsettled, as if carrying a heavy burden. Kido then spoke to him directly, saying that Junpei had changed since coming here. Closing his eyes, Kido added that he was sorry for how he had treated him before. Junpei stood speechless at the unexpected apology. Then Kido said they should perhaps consider running away after all. Nariko, however, insisted that she was the one chosen as the sacrifice. Junpei immediately rejected her words, his voice filled with determination. He declared that he would go instead. Nariko called out his name, startled by his resolve. Junpei then looked at her and told her that when she had said they should do their best together, he had promised himself that he would change for her sake. Since that moment, he had worked as hard as he could, never once giving up. He smiled faintly and said that he wouldn't die, that he would survive no matter what. They would surely meet again afterward. Later, the decision was made. Junpei discussed it with the other men, and together they set off toward the labyrinth. Eventually, its entrance came into sight. As they stood before it, Junpei muttered quietly. The vast structure loomed over them, dark, ominous, and unnatural, its aura heavy enough to make their hearts tremble. Junpei took a cautious step forward, and the others followed slowly, their steps echoing in the hollow air. When he reached the white boundary line marking the labyrinth's entrance, he stopped. Kido pointed at it, remarking that it must signify the threshold. Then he turned to Junpei and asked if he was truly certain about this. Junpei said nothing at first. Nariko, her voice trembling, urged him to let her go instead. But Junpei refused firmly. Turning to Kido, he asked him to take care of Nariko in his absence. Kido simply nodded and agreed. Fear flickered in Junpei's eyes, but he steadied his breath. He told himself that from this point on, he would be inside the sacrificial labyrinth. He wondered if he could really make it out alive. Then, with a fierce will, he vowed he would not die. Not for himself, but for Nariko, and for everyone who had come to see him off. Suddenly, Nariko's voice cut through the tension, calling his name. She began to speak of the labyrinth, how it was a place of endless ravines and yawning chasms, said to have appeared thousands of years ago, bringing misfortune and catastrophe to the world ever since. She explained that the labyrinth was considered impregnable. Many renowned adventurers had attempted to conquer it, yet none had ever returned. She shouted that claiming he would come back alive was impossible, the survival rate was 0. Junpei turned toward her in disbelief, demanding to know what she was saying. But Nariko ignored him and continued, her tone shifting into something almost sharp. She said that, according to the Royal Research Institution's Magic Division, the labyrinth wasn't part of this world at all. With a faint smirk, she revealed that once he crossed its threshold, he would vanish from both this world and the next, transported to somewhere entirely different. That was why the labyrinth near the village had been named the Sacrificial Labyrinth. Junpei froze, his body stiff with shock. Before he could react, Nariko suddenly leaned toward Kido and kissed him in front of him. Junpei's eyes widened in disbelief. The other men burst out laughing, shouting that it was a complete success, their laughter echoing around them. Kido scoffed and apologized mockingly, saying that he and Nariko had started going out recently. Kido's tone turned cold as he explained that their plan would have been meaningless if Junpei, the so-called sacrifice, hadn't volunteered for it willingly. That was why they decided to play a small trick on him, to make it more entertaining. After all, simply running away from a sacrifice ritual would have been too dull. Nariko then spoke, saying that it was true the village elder had chosen her as the sacrifice. That fact wasn't a lie. But because of that, she and Kido had come up with a plan together. Then, with a cruel smirk, he asked if Junpei still didn't understand. Even if they had similar stats, between a worthless man like him and a woman's body, which one did he think had more value? Junpei's voice finally escaped him, trembling with shock and pain as he asked if everything, all of it, had been a lie. His eyes turned to Nariko, desperate for denial. Without hesitation, Nariko confirmed it was true. Tears welled in Junpei's eyes. He asked again, barely managing to speak, reminding her that she had once said she would never hate him. Nariko gave a mocking laugh and answered that she didn't hate him, but she didn't like him either. Junpei cried out, asking about what she'd said before, about protecting and helping each other. Noriko smiled coldly and replied that those words had only mattered back when they were still in the safe zone. Then, her lips curved into a sneer as she added that once he finally realized how deep in despair he was, he would see that those promises had been nothing but empty words, lies meant to comfort a fool. She went on, her tone dripping with cruel amusement, saying that she couldn't believe he had actually volunteered to take her place as the sacrifice. She mocked him for his kindness, saying that while it was admirable, kindness alone could not solve anything. Her expression hardened, and her voice rose sharply as she spat out her final judgment. He was nothing but an idiot. The insult shattered whatever strength Junpei had left. Tears streamed freely down his face. His chest ached with a pain so heavy it drowned out all thought. Then Kito's voice thundered beside him, shouting that he had heard enough, and that Junpei should go and die inside the labyrinth. Without warning, Kito kicked him hard. Junpei's body was thrown backward, crashing violently to the ground and tumbling across the white boundary line that marked the entrance to the labyrinth. Almost immediately, the ground trembled. A transparent wall began to rise slowly between them, sealing Junpei away from the outside world. Junpei screamed in his thoughts as he stared at it, the word wall echoing desperately in his mind. Kito smirked cruelly from the other side, saying that they would be leaving now. With Junpei's pathetic status, even the best pursuers couldn't catch them. He gave a mocking farewell. This, he said, would be the last time he bullied him. Noriko added her own farewell, thanking him sarcastically for all the fun she'd had. Junpei's eyes were filled with pain and betrayal. The two people he had trusted most had deceived him completely. His mind went blank, as if his emotions had been drained from him. Later, he found himself muttering quietly to no one. He couldn't remember what happened after that moment, only that he had kept walking, dazed and hollow. Eventually, he noticed a door standing open before him. Without hesitation, Junpei stepped through it, his heart still heavy with confusion and grief. In the center of the dimly lit room beyond, something was waiting. A monster, its presence radiating menace, stood silently, watching him. Junpei's memories from not long ago came rushing back. Until that moment, everything in his mind had been hazy, but as soon as he saw the scene before him, clarity struck like lightning. He stood frozen in place, nerves trembling, facing the terrifying creature before him. The words of the gods suddenly echoed in his mind. The skill bestowed upon him was the gift given to them all. Acting on instinct, he activated his skill. A glowing screen appeared before the monster, displaying its information: No Life King, Undead King, Danger Level, SS. Confusion and fear gripped Junpei. SS level danger, what did that even mean? He instinctively stepped backward, but the floor beneath him groaned in protest, cracking under his weight. The surface was fragile, barely able to support him. As he looked down at the fissures spreading beneath his feet, an ominous chill ran through him. When he lifted his gaze again, it was already too late. The undead king had closed the distance. The massive, decaying figure loomed before him, and Junpei let out a strangled cry. Before he could turn to flee, the monster's blade sliced across his back. Agonizing pain erupted, and his body collapsed to the ground. His eyes widened in horror, scattered bones carpeted the floor around him. A deafening crack followed. The floor gave way entirely, and Junpei's body plunged into the abyss. As he fell, he could still see the silhouette of the undead king growing smaller above him. Darkness swallowed his vision. When he finally regained consciousness, he was shocked to find himself alive. The pain was gone. He reached behind him. The wound on his back was closing before his eyes. Flesh and skin knit together unnaturally fast. He could hardly believe what he was seeing. A faint glow surrounded him. He realized he was sitting atop a mountain of corpses, an eerie luminescent circle encompassing the area. Confused and wary, he noticed something glinting among the bones, a small slate or perhaps a card. He picked it up, unable to decipher the writing etched onto its surface. Suddenly, the card shimmered and an image appeared, a man's figure, grinning as though alive. His laughter echoed faintly. It was some kind of recording. The man greeted him and explained that this was a message, not a conversation. He was an adventurer who had once entered this same dungeon, leaving behind his advice for whoever came next. The man began introducing himself in a casual tone. His level, he said, was somewhere around 200, a high rank, considering the world's greatest swordsman barely reached 300. His skills were retrovision and appraisal, which had allowed him to make it this far. Junpei's gut told him one thing: this place was far more dangerous than he'd imagined. The adventurer continued. He explained that the creature Junpei had just encountered was extremely perceptive, In a narrow area like this, even the slightest noise would alert it. Still, there existed strange, safe zones within the dungeon, places where monsters could not enter and where wounds would heal. The man admitted he didn't understand how or why these zones existed, but their presence made him uneasy. Junpei realized then that the glowing circle around him must be one of those safe zones. The man's tone shifted. He began to talk about that guy, the undead king. He explained that it wasn't just powerful, but absurdly so. Physical and magical attacks were both completely nullified. Even through his retrovision skill, he had confirmed that ordinary attacks were useless. Junpei listened in silence, dread settling in. What kind of monster was that thing? The message continued. The man urged that anyone who came after him should also leave information behind for future survivors. He revealed that he had witnessed the creature being defeated several times through retrovision, but every time, a massive explosion of magic had obscured the details. He never managed to see how the victory was achieved. Because of that, he advised the only sensible course: escape. He told Junpei that if he ran east, he would find a door leading to the next level. Run with everything he had because his life depended on it. The man warned that while the safe zone protected him, it couldn't sustain him. He would eventually starve if he stayed there. Finally, the recording ended with a light-hearted farewell, adios, and the man's image vanished. Junpei stood in silence for a moment, feeling oddly steadied by the man's message. A strange sense of calm replaced his earlier panic. Staying here meant certain starvation, leaving meant a chance at survival. With a quiet breath, he rose to his feet. Somewhere above, the undead king prowled. But Junpei knew now, he was beneath that creature, and his only path was forward. Junpei looked upward, his eyes tracing the rough stone surface of the pillar before him. He told himself he could climb it, he had to. Once he reached the top, he would sprint toward the exit with everything he had left. Success was uncertain, but there was no alternative. A faint, self-mocking laugh escaped him. Survive first, everything else could come after. That was all that mattered now. But then he paused. A fragment of memory resurfaced, the result of his previous appraisal. The monster's attacks were declared useless against, yet its HP had been listed as low, its vitality weak. How could that be? If attacks were truly ineffective, how could it still possess low HP? He ground his teeth together. Think. Come on, think, Takeda Junpei. His thoughts raced. His very survival depended on the decision he would make here. The creature's body was frail, its health minimal, and yet it could not die. Why? What was the contradiction hiding behind that fact? If the letter he found was telling the truth, then there had to be a method, some condition under which the undead king could be defeated. But what was it? The man's words came back to him. Nullified attacks, area of effect, magic, chaotic battle, explosion, effectiveness confirmed. Junpei froze, breath caught in his throat as realization dawned. His pulse quickened. The pattern clicked together in his mind. The chaos, the mass explosion, the reason ordinary strikes failed. It all aligned. That must be it. That was how the creature was beaten before. But then another thought followed. He was alone. To recreate a chaotic battle with a massive explosion, it was impossible for one person. What could he do? He looked upward again, his eyes landing on something above. An idea flickered. If he used that, then perhaps. His gaze sharpened, then widened in shock as another realization struck, stronger this time. Wait, if it's like this, then the answer's been right in front of me the whole time. Everything fit. The conditions, the environment, the setup. His heart pounded with wild energy. Victory was right there, within reach. He just needed to act. But then, he stopped. His expression shifted, the light in his eyes dimmed. Doubt crept back in. No. He couldn't do it. Acting recklessly now could end everything. He forced himself to breathe slowly, telling himself to focus on escaping instead. Maybe the next floor would have weaker monsters, something he could actually handle. But just as that fragile thought formed, Nariko's words echoed from his memory. Words he had once taken at face value. Now, standing in this nightmare, he realized they were hollow bullshit born from desperation. He fell silent. Maybe, he thought, Nariko had been just as hopeless. Maybe her charm, her submission, had been her only bargaining chip to survive among the powerful. He didn't know what she truly felt, or whether anything she'd said to him had been genuine. But one thing was certain, her choice had been right. Because in this world, no matter where one stood, the truth never changed. The powerless would always be trampled. His mind screamed those words. Junpei clutched his hair, shaking in frustration. What the hell is wrong with you, Takeda Junpei? He raged inwardly. Thinking there'll be easier enemies on the next floor? What kind of joke is that? The thought of waiting for something safer, something merciful, was delusion. He sprinted toward the wall and began climbing again, scraping his hands raw against the jagged stone. Level 1. Trash stats. No power, no skills, nothing, he told himself. Then all the more reason, if there's even a single chance, no matter how small, I'll take it. His fingers found a ledge. He pulled himself up, breath ragged, and finally reached the top. The undead king loomed ahead, its hollow eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. Junpei met its gaze without flinching. His body trembled, but his resolve burned hotter than fear. The monster began to advance, slow and deliberate. Come on, come closer. Junpei's thoughts pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat. Just a little more. When the creature drew near enough, he took a deep breath. Now. He stomped his foot hard against the ground. The undead king's scythe lifted high, glinting in the dim light as it prepared to strike. With a roar that tore from the depths of his lungs, Junpei hurled himself upward, leaping into the air, his body soaring above the undead king's reach. Junpei hurled himself through the air, shouting as he descended upon the undead king. The monster reacted instantly, swinging its massive scythe upward. The blade grazed Junpei's forehead, slicing it open. A spray of blood arced into the air. But Junpei didn't falter. His momentum carried him downward, closer and closer to the ground. The undead king's hollow eyes followed his movements with eerie precision, though there was a trace of hesitation. It couldn't understand what Junpei was attempting. He landed with crushing force near the monster, the impact cracking the already fragile surface beneath his feet. The fissures spread in every direction until the ground completely gave way. A sharp grin formed on Junpei's blood-stained face as the floor collapsed beneath them both. He understood now. This was the true nature of the No-Life King's power. The monster's ability to nullify attacks only worked against what it consciously recognized as an attack. Anything beyond its awareness, anything unexpected, it could not defend against. Junpei fell alongside the creature, his thoughts burning with clarity. If it couldn't perceive the danger, it couldn't block it. That was the loophole. That was his victory. The undead king plunged downward, its heavy frame crashing into the field of jagged stone spikes below. The sharpened rocks tore through its decayed flesh and shattered bones. Junpei hit the lower ground hard, pain coursing through his body, but he forced himself to move. Crawling across the broken terrain, he dragged himself into the glowing boundary of the safe zone. As soon as he entered, warmth surged through him. The wounds across his body began to close, his skin knitting back together under the light. He lay there panting, realization settling in. The chaotic battles mentioned in the adventurer's message, the massive explosions, they hadn't been random. They were deliberate distractions, ways to drive the monster into a trap. With its fragile body, a fall like that would ensure its destruction. Others who came before him must have discovered the same trick. A tired but satisfied smile crept onto Junpei's face. He had done it. He'd killed the undead king. Without the safe zone's healing power, he would have been finished, but he'd survived. Relief turned into exhilaration. For the first time since entering this dungeon, he'd actually won. But his moment of triumph was cut short. A strange heat suddenly spread through his hands, something was flowing into him. He looked down in confusion, just as a translucent status window appeared before his eyes. His level number was climbing rapidly, 25, 30, 60. It didn't stop. Junpei stared in disbelief as it shot upward, the digits flashing faster and faster. He whispered in astonishment, realizing what was happening. Experience points were flooding into him, endlessly accumulating. The numbers surged again, level 178. His status points skyrocketed to 885. He stood, trembling slightly, half in shock and half in awe. 885 points, enough to reshape his entire being. He wondered how to distribute them, how to best use this sudden power. His eyes shifted to the undead king's motionless corpse. The god's voice from before echoed faintly in his mind, "Defeat your enemies and take their skills." Junpei crouched beside the fallen monster, uncertain how the process worked. Maybe it was as simple as contact. He placed a hand on the creature's skull. Immediately, its body began to emit a dim glow. Lines of light twisted upward and formed shimmering cards in the air before him. Each one bore the name of a skill or item. Junpei's eyes widened. There were weapons here. One card depicted something unmistakable, a gun. He muttered in astonishment, realizing such things could exist in this world. It must have been brought here from another realm, some artifact left behind by an adventurer from a different world. A moment later, the gun materialized in his grasp, its metallic surface cool and unfamiliar. Another card caught his attention, resistance to all abnormalities. He wasn't entirely sure what to do with it, but it was undoubtedly valuable. Then another card appeared, flesh of the undead. The description beneath it made him pause. With just one bite, he stared at the words, heart-pounding. Resistance to all abnormalities, and this. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. If he used them together, if the combination worked, he might actually escape this hell. Resolve flared in his chest. He picked up the card, and at once the item materialized in his palm. A piece of rotting, grayish flesh, the remains of the undead king. Junpei looked down at it, silent for a long moment. The stench made him gag slightly. He stared at the grotesque thing in his hand and thought, with grim disbelief, "Is this really something I'm supposed to eat?" Junpei fell utterly silent, lost in a storm of thought. The question hammered at him, abandon his humanity, yes or no? A cold sweat traced his cheek. He opened his status window and began to allocate points. The numbers climbed upward and his eyes widened in surprise. He checked his skills. Appraisal, resistance to all abnormalities, and 9 empty skill slots staring back at him. He reminded himself he could not lower his guard, whatever awaited on the next level might be worse. There was a sliver of hope to escape, but with his current strength the odds were hopelessly small. His gaze dropped again to the rotting flesh in his hand. Disgust twisted his features, yet resolve flamed in his eyes. He opened his mouth and bit down. He forced himself to chew, jaw clenching as sweat gathered on his brow. He kept repeating the question in his head, finally choosing yes. Each bite tasted foul, but with every chew memories sharpened. Kido, Nariko, the betrayal, the bitter, burning anger. They had tossed him into this place to die. Unforgivable. Furious, he swallowed the last piece. The flesh vanished, and with it any remaining hesitation. For a long, tense moment nothing moved. Then his eyes changed, lit by an uncontainable fire. Without speaking, he tore a scrap of cloth and fashioned it into a crude pouch, muttering the names Kido and Nariko as he worked. He tucked the gun into the pouch and tied it closed with methodical calm. He shrugged the undead king's cloak over his shoulders. With a voice trembling from rage, he vowed to shred them all to pieces. Sitting casually on the floor, the god let out a quiet, amused laugh. He murmured to himself that he'd seen it coming, that things would unfold exactly this way. A woman approached and respectfully offered him a drink. He turned to her with a faint smile, thanking her, and remarked that the human below truly was extraordinary. But the woman's tone was cold and desperate. She said she didn't care, she only wanted to die. The god ignored her plea, eyes still fixed elsewhere, saying instead that he was curious to see just how far Takeda Junpei could make it through the dungeon. Behind him, the woman's voice repeated the same words, again and again, "Please kill me." The god only smirked, whispering the name as though savoring it, Takeda Junpei. Far below, in the darkness of the dungeon, a colossal monster towered over Junpei. He activated appraisal instinctively, and a glowing window appeared before his eyes, revealing its name, Mammoth Beetle, Danger Level A. The description confirmed it was a heavily armored, charging-type creature. Junpei's expression hardened. It seemed that investing so many points into speed had been the right decision. Without that advantage, the creature's sheer velocity would have already flattened him. That same speed had also helped him locate the safe zone earlier. He glanced at the glowing slate, the letter left behind by the unknown adventurer, and muttered that he owed this much to that meddlesome old man's advice. Almost on cue, the image of the man appeared again from the letter. His cheerful, recorded laughter echoed through the air. He greeted Junpei like an old friend, joking that a hero might just be in the making here. To have survived the undead king was no small feat. Then he launched into his usual tips, explaining that the boss of this floor was none other than the massive beetle he'd just encountered. According to him, the monster's defense was absurdly strong. It just kept charging at anything in sight. Dodging 1 or 2 charges might be possible, but actually defeating it under those conditions would be hopeless. Which was why, he laughed, Junpei should stick with the tried-and-true plan, run like hell. That was all the time he had, he said, and with a bright grin and a final adios amigo, his image faded away. Junpei stood still for a while, smirking faintly. Escaping would certainly be the safest option. But if all he ever did was run, he'd never grow stronger. Someday, fleeing would no longer save him. That was why he needed to seize every single opportunity, no matter how dangerous, to strengthen himself. 10 hours later, Junpei stood again before the mammoth beetle. The air around him smelled of damp earth and gunpowder. He raised the firearm in his hand, staring down its barrel at the towering creature. Its armor gleamed under the dungeon's faint light. He muttered to himself that its defense was indeed ridiculous, but not invincible. Junpei fired. The sound cracked through the air, echoing against the walls. He squeezed off several more rounds before retreating back into the safety of the glowing circle. Empty shells clattered to the floor as he opened the gun's chamber and let them fall, then calmly reloaded. He waited for his mana to recover, then stepped forward again. Fire. Retreat. Reload. Regenerate. Repeat. Hours passed. His movements became mechanical, efficient. The rhythm of battle and recovery blurred together until it became routine. His confidence grew, the exhaustion replaced by a quiet satisfaction. He would camp this thing endlessly if he had to. 70 hours later, the mammoth beetle finally collapsed. Its legs twitched once, then went still. Junpei exhaled deeply, his body heavy from fatigue. He muttered that it was finally over, this endless grind, and that now he was starving. He approached the fallen monster to claim his reward. As soon as he touched its carapace, the corpse began to glow faintly. 2 cards materialized in front of him. One read, Legendary Rank Unique Armor. The other, Rare Skill Mammoth Beetle Flesh. Junpei read the descriptions under his breath. The armor boasted high defense. The other item was just what it sounded like, flesh. Edible, apparently. He grimaced but shrugged, muttering that he supposed he'd have to eat it. Elsewhere, the god chuckled quietly, watching the scene unfold from afar. He said he couldn't claim to be surprised. It was exactly as he expected. The real question now was what Junpei would do next. How far would he go to escape? He smirked, saying that it seemed the boy's decision had already been made. Behind him, the woman spoke again, her tone unchanged, lifeless. Please, kill me. Time passed. Eventually, Junpei stood before another heavy stone door. With a deep breath, he pushed it open and stepped through. On the other side stretched a wide, dimly lit chamber, and, to his astonishment, another safe zone lay right at the entrance. Relief flickered across his face. But then a massive shadow fell over him. He looked up. A gigantic 3-headed beast stood before him, its black fur bristling, its eyes burning red. Junpei's expression remained calm. He invoked appraisal again, and the window flashed before him. Cerberus, danger level, mythical rank. For a moment, he froze. Then a laugh broke from his throat, half disbelief, half defiance. A mythical ranked monster? What kind of absurd label was that supposed to be? To him, it was nothing more than a dog. Junpei's eyes drifted toward the letter lying beside him. He picked it up and turned it over in his hand, noting that it was the same mysterious letter that had appeared before. As soon as he did, the man's image emerged once again from within the parchment, cheerful and loud as always. With his usual grin, the man remarked that Junpei had really gotten himself into quite the predicament this time. Facing a mythological monster as an opponent was absolute madness, he said. Only a fool would even consider fighting something like that. The man went on, explaining that against that creature's lightning speed and razor-sharp fangs, the fight would be entirely one-sided. Even if Junpei tried to attack from a distance, the beast would easily dodge every shot. Then, his tone grew slightly more serious as he offered one last warning. Junpei had to be especially cautious whenever the Cerberus stepped backward. That movement, he explained, was a signal that the creature was about to strike. Cold sweat gathered on Junpei's forehead as he listened. The man gave a short, helpless laugh, saying that there was nothing more to add. This situation was beyond awful. He encouraged Junpei to come up with an escape plan as quickly as possible. Still chuckling, he added that if Junpei did somehow manage to make it out alive, he'd probably be missing a few limbs. With that, he ended the message the same way he always did, hoping their paths would cross someday. Adios, the man said before his image faded away. Junpei remained silent for a moment, staring into the empty space where the illusion had vanished. Then, a smirk crept across his face. If the Cerberus was that powerful, then the experience points it would yield had to be enormous. Maybe luck really was smiling on him today. Even so, he admitted to himself that he had no idea whether he could truly keep up with the monster's speed, or if his plan would even work. But the uncertainty only hardened his resolve. He would test it and see for himself. Junpei stepped out of the shimmering boundary of the safe zone, his every movement deliberate. He thought to begin by testing his speed. The instant his foot crossed the line, the Cerberus moved. In less than a blink, the 3-headed beast lunged forward, its claws tearing across the stone floor. Junpei twisted his body at the last possible second, narrowly dodging the massive jaws that snapped inches from his head. His pulse thundered. He grinned through the rush of adrenaline. He told himself he could do this. His agility stat, 1390, wasn't just a number. It was proof of his growth. His confidence surged. It worked. His speed was enough to match it. Now it was time for the real fight. Junpei squared his stance and fixed his gaze on the Cerberus. His muscles tensed as he prepared to counter. But then, the monster suddenly stopped moving. Its stance shifted, and the air around it grew dense and heavy. Junpei froze, wondering what it was doing. Without warning, the Cerberus let out a deafening roar. A concussive wave exploded outward, slamming into Junpei and sending him flying backward. He hit the ground hard, his entire body shuddering with pain. A thick, metallic taste filled his mouth. He struggled to raise his head. Smoke was pouring from each of the creature's 3 mouths. A glowing status window appeared before him, identifying the skill, Dead Howling. Junpei cursed inwardly. That had been completely unexpected. He tried to move but found his body unresponsive. His mind raced. Maybe his resistance to abnormal status effects was still working partially. His head could move, but his arms and legs were locked in place. The Cerberus began to advance slowly, its claws scraping against the stone. Move, he commanded himself. His body remained rigid. Move. He repeated in his mind, his thoughts turning frantic. He began chanting it to himself, over and over. If his resistance skill was still active, then this wasn't over yet. He only needed to shock his body hard enough to disrupt the paralysis, something to jolt his brain back into motion. The Cerberus opened its jaws, preparing another strike. A faint spark of an idea ignited in Junpei's mind, followed by a low, breathless chuckle. His body trembled, but his eyes sharpened with determination. He straightened his back and faced the monster head-on. There was one surefire way to inflict an overwhelming amount of pain on himself. He stuck out his tongue, slowly closing his teeth around it. The Cerberus growled, its 3 heads lowering in unison. Then Junpei bit down hard. Blood burst from his mouth, splattering across the stone floor. The pain was instant, searing through every nerve in his body. Blood gushed from Junpei's wounded tongue as the Cerberus towered over him, roaring with ferocity. Junpei braced himself, lifting his hand toward the monster. The Cerberus lunged forward, sinking its massive fangs into his arm and tearing it apart. A sharp burst of agony tore through Junpei's body, and blood poured from his mouth as he stumbled backward, gasping and coughing crimson with every breath. In front of him, the Cerberus stood with blood dripping from its jaws as it chewed on his torn flesh. Junpei's body trembled violently, his mind clouded by waves of pain and despair. Yet even as his body screamed, the pain in his chest weighed heavier, an ache far deeper than the wounds tearing at his flesh. Thoughts collided within him, confusion, rage, grief, all swallowed by a single, consuming urge. The word kill echoed endlessly in his mind. Kill everything in this dungeon. Kill Kido. Kill Noriko. Kill them all. Then, suddenly, his thoughts sharpened. The haze faded. He looked at his arm, the torn flesh was whole again. The Cerberus stood frozen before him, its massive frame trembling. Junpei exhaled slowly, his expression darkening. The air between them thickened, heavy with tension. Then, without warning, the beast staggered, its knees buckling beneath it. It collapsed with a thunderous crash, unmoving. Junpei's lips twisted into a faint smile. He rose to his feet, staring down at the fallen creature. His heart pounded as he realized the result of what he had done, his first time using that ability. He wasn't even sure how effective it was, but the sight before him proved enough. Even a myth-ranked monster like Cerberus had fallen after consuming his arm. He took a deep breath. There was no time to rest or marvel. The monster might still recover, and he had to finish it now. Raising his gun, he fired at the creature. The bullet grazed its hide, leaving only a shallow mark. A normal attack was useless against something like this. Without hesitation, Junpei sank his teeth into his own wrist. Blood spurted out in thick streams, coating his hand. He extended the bleeding wound near the monster's nose. Cerberus twitched, its body reacting instinctively to the scent. Junpei's blood dripped steadily, seeping into its nostrils, further spreading the toxin through its body. He then removed the bullets from his gun and gathered a small pile of dry twigs. Placing the bullets among them, he struck them hard with a stone. A sharp crack split the air as sparks flared, igniting the makeshift pile. Smoke rose, thin at first, then billowing upward as flames caught. The fire spread rapidly, a flickering blaze that danced beneath Cerberus's muzzle. Its nostrils flared, and it recoiled at the scent and sight of the flame. Junpei's smirk deepened. The fire roared, the smoke twisting into the sky as the monster's flesh began to burn. Its hide sizzled, blistering and melting under the heat. Cerberus's body convulsed, its howls shaking the air. The scent of scorched fur and blood filled the dungeon. Junpei stepped closer, watching without emotion as the once mighty beast was consumed by flame. When the fire died down, he reached out and touched the creature's charred body. A faint shimmer appeared above it, a skill card labeled Dead Howling, and 2 item drops, Beast Flesh and Beast Fang. Junpei glanced at them. The skill was worthless, affecting only those weaker than himself. The flesh, likely as foul-tasting as it looked, would have to do for now. But the last drop caught his attention. The Beast Fang card pulsed with light. When the glow faded, a sharp fang materialized in his palm. Junpei's expression shifted from exhaustion to quiet satisfaction. He turned the fang over in his hand, noting its size and edge, a perfect makeshift blade. Far away, within the halls of the god's headquarters, the deity overseeing him suddenly froze. A realization struck. He had forgotten something crucial. He had never told Junpei how to use the bot. Panic seized him as he called out for Chenny, ordering her to go to Junpei and explain its use before it was too late. Chenny hesitated, uncertain whether approaching him would mean her death. The god merely gave a vague response, his attention wandering to her appearance, amused by how wild she looked in her current attire. At the same time, Junpei grimaced in disgust. The taste lingering in his mouth was unbearable, and his thoughts were filled with irritation toward whoever had claimed that beetles were edible. He stepped forward through the door and entered the next floor. He surveyed his surroundings carefully. The place looked strange, unfamiliar, yet oddly still. It felt similar to the previous floors, but something about it was different. He realized he was in a safe zone, but then paused. Could this entire floor be a safe zone? The absence of any enemies made no sense to him. His thoughts were interrupted when a woman appeared before him without warning. The sudden presence made him flinch, his body tensing instinctively. The woman observed him quietly, murmuring to herself as if confirming his identity. Junpei stood alert, studying her every movement. The woman addressed him by name, her tone formal, almost ceremonial. He instinctively activated his appraisal ability, yet nothing registered. She was not a monster. A normal human, it seemed, though her attire was far from ordinary. The woman introduced herself as Chenny, a servant under the god who had been watching over Junpei. Her words carried both reverence and disdain as she described her master, a being of twisted mind and corrupt nature. Junpei cut her off before she could continue, his patience thinning. Chenny assured him she would keep his reaction private, claiming their exchange would remain a secret. Junpei quickly clarified that her insults did not come from him, and after a brief moment to collect himself, redirected the conversation back to the matter at hand. Chenny explained that she had come to deliver a forgotten part of his tutorial. Raising her hand, she summoned a box that appeared in midair. It hovered soundlessly, radiating a faint glow. She explained that he could summon one like it simply by calling for it, a personal storage space that could hold and retrieve any item he obtained. Every individual in this world possessed a box, she said, its size and form determined by their magical strength. As long as his magic was sufficient, he could store nearly anything inside, even living beings. However, she cautioned that unwilling targets could not be forced into the box. If he wanted to collect monsters, he would first have to subjugate them. Junpei repeated her words in his mind and tried summoning his own box. Immediately, a similar object appeared before him. It floated silently, shimmering faintly in the dim light. He examined it carefully, realizing it was indeed his. He wondered whether it could serve a purpose beyond storage, perhaps even as a weapon. Chenny replied that such use depended entirely on the user's creativity and power. Normally, however, it was simply a storage tool. She concluded the tutorial, asking if he had any further questions. Junpei hesitated, briefly tempted to inquire about her bizarre outfit, but decided against it. He gave a curt response instead. Chenny's expression hardened as she felt his gaze. To her, it was as though he were scrutinizing her inappropriately, though she quickly brushed the thought aside, deciding it was her imagination. Declaring her task complete, she announced her departure and vanished instantly, leaving behind only silence. Junpei exhaled deeply, rubbing his temples. The encounter had been exasperating. He muttered to himself that her behavior matched perfectly with someone serving that insane deity. As he prepared to move on, something on the ground caught his attention, a letter. He picked it up, turning it over in his hand. The surface shimmered faintly, and suddenly the image of the same man appeared from within. The man greeted him with exaggerated cheer, acting as though they were old companions reunited. His tone was carefree, even mocking, as he spoke of Junpei's earlier battle with Cerberus and how he had fled. He then went on to explain that this floor was different from the previous ones. People actually lived here. Junpei's brows furrowed in confusion as he processed those words. The man's image within the letter continued speaking, explaining that the entire floor functioned as a safe zone. Those who had survived near-death experiences in the upper levels had chosen to remain here, building quiet lives for themselves in peace. It was, he said, an understandable decision, a place for those weary of constant struggle to finally rest. He then posed a question, suggesting that Junpei could do the same. There were small villages scattered throughout the valley. If he wished, he could choose one, settle there, and live the remainder of his life in calm obscurity. Junpei remained silent, his gaze distant. The man, as if already knowing his answer, continued. He said that Junpei would surely keep climbing, that someone like him, who detested the company of others and preferred solitude, would never stop here. Junpei let out a faint smile, exhaling softly. The man's image began to flicker, his voice fading as he bid farewell. He said they would meet again if fate permitted it. And then, the message dissolved into thin air. Junpei stood motionless for a while, processing what he had heard. He murmured under his breath, realizing that the eccentric goddess did not dwell on this floor after all. A sudden movement caught his eye. From a distance, a woman stood watching him. Her presence startled him. Another woman? He wondered cautiously. Was she one of the villagers the man had mentioned? The woman waved, calling out to him with energetic familiarity. Her demeanor was bright and cheerful, her curiosity evident as she remarked that he must have come from the upper levels. Junpei answered curtly, confirming her guess, and cautiously asked who she was. The woman smiled warmly and introduced herself as Katerina, a resident of a nearby village nestled within the valley. Her tone carried genuine friendliness as she greeted him. Junpei hesitated, awkwardly returning the introduction, stating his name. Katerina's expression softened into a charming smile as she repeated his name lightly, addressing him with easy familiarity. Junpei's thoughts stirred uneasily. A village, so there truly were people living here. The woman seemed kind enough, but he knew better than to lower his guard. Still, compared to that deranged deity's servant, this one seemed refreshingly normal. Then, without warning, Katerina made a request that stunned him into silence. Her suddenness and tone were both disarming and impossible to predict. Junpei froze, staring at her in disbelief. Her next word struck even harder, a clarification so blunt and shameless it left him completely speechless. His mind blanked, his body stiffened, and for a long moment he could only stare. He pressed a hand to his forehead, exasperation washing over him. His thoughts swirled with disbelief, questioning whether every woman in this world had somehow lost their sense of reason. Katerina, however, only smiled sheepishly, waving off her earlier words as she tried to explain herself. Beneath her flustered demeanor, her tone grew serious. She insisted that her request was not a joke. There was a grave situation unfolding, one that left her desperate. Her expression shifted, losing its playful warmth. She asked him to walk with her, saying she would explain along the way. Junpei, though still wary, agreed without further hesitation. Katerina thanked him, her voice quiet now. As she turned, the brightness in her face dimmed, her expression shadowed by something heavy, the weight of whatever truth she was about to reveal. Chapter 7 begins. The woman introduced herself as Katrina. She lived in a small village nestled within the valley. She greeted him warmly and offered to show him around. Katrina explained that their village had originally been founded by just a handful of people. Over the decades, their numbers had grown to about 50. Because of their isolation, she only knew about life within their community. Anything beyond the village was a mystery to her. She motioned for him to crouch down beside her. As they hid together, Katrina mentioned that she had heard stories claiming that when people had children with their close relatives, those children were often born with deformities. Junpei wondered if she was referring to recessive genetic mutations caused by inbreeding. Katrina went on to say that since there were almost no outsiders except for passing adventurers, the villagers had no choice but to seek them out for reproduction. Junpei understood what she was implying and called out to her, asking what was going on. A group of goblins had crept into view, and both of them remained hidden. Katrina explained that they were hunting, an activity essential to their survival. Junpei muttered to himself, thinking that from his appraisal, these goblins looked like ordinary monsters. Katrina raised her hand to signal the attack. She then explained that while this entire floor was supposed to be a safe zone, monsters still appeared. The reason, she said, was that the safe zone's power was spread too thin across such a vast area, weakening its effect and allowing weaker monsters to slip through. Because of that, those creatures had become an important food source for the villagers. One of the men charged forward and swung his weapon at a goblin, but the creature dodged with surprising speed and retaliated, slashing its sword across the man's arm. Junpei noted that the injury looked serious, but Katrina calmly assured him that it was fine. The recovery effect in this zone was weak, but it would keep the man alive. She then mentioned that she was planning to lure more monsters over and asked what Junpei intended to do. He looked at her and realized that she had orchestrated this situation deliberately. She admitted it without hesitation, saying that she wanted to see how strong his seed was. Junpei sighed to himself. He had no real reason to indulge her, but he was also curious to test the strength of the local monsters. Moments later, screams echoed through the forest. Junpei had swiftly annihilated the goblins. Within only a few seconds, all were dead. Katrina clapped and praised his strength, calling him incredible and referring to him affectionately as her dear husband. Junpei let out a long sigh in response. Then Katrina stepped closer, her tone shifting. She remarked that he was so powerful no one could possibly oppose his lineage, and teasingly suggested they should have sex once the hunt was done. Before Junpei could react, one of the men behind them spoke up, saying they would leave the rest of the work to Katrina. She casually agreed. Junpei's face flushed as Katrina approached the slain goblins. She activated her skill, Butcher. Her hand glowed as she efficiently processed the corpses one after another. Each time she used the skill, item cards appeared, filling the ground around her. Junpei was astonished by the amount of meat produced from the kills. Katrina simply explained that this was her job. Junpei remained silent as she continued working. Katrina went on to explain that their village relied mostly on crops, but without meat, they would suffer from a severe lack of protein. These hunted monsters, she said, were the key to keeping their people alive and healthy. Katrina mentioned that although she had been told since childhood that their bodies needed something called protein, she never truly understood what it was. Over the years, she had honed her butcher skill to the ultra grade, and at that level, she could select exactly which items to extract when using it. Junpei fell deep into thought as he listened. From her explanation, it seemed that their village truly lacked any natural source of protein. No animals, no edible plants, not even insects. Without those grotesque pieces of monster meat, they would have long succumbed to malnutrition. It was, he thought, an appalling existence. Then Katrina's voice broke his thoughts as she wondered aloud about his status. Without hesitation, Junpei displayed it for her. The moment his stats appeared, Katrina and the other villagers reacted with shock. She muttered that his abilities were quite unbalanced, and Junpei explained that he had distributed his points deliberately after considering many factors. Katrina noted that his build leaned heavily toward speed, and she quietly questioned what he had done about defense. Before he could respond, she suddenly seized his arm. Junpei gave her a confused glance. Katrina calmly stated that her base attack power was 80, implying that he wouldn't be able to escape. Before he could react, a blow struck him from behind. Darkness began to consume his vision. He heard Katrina's voice faintly, expressing her gratitude and saying that he had saved them the trouble of drugging his meal. Junpei tried to activate his appraisal skill, but before the incantation could finish, he blacked out completely. A window appeared briefly: Valley villagers, danger level, normal humans. When he awoke, he was in a basement. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood, and the walls were lined with butcher's tools of every shape and size. His arms and legs were shackled in heavy chains. A cheerful voice echoed through the dim room. Katrina greeted him warmly, smiling as she asked how he liked their new home. She picked up her equipment from a nearby table, the metallic clink of the blades filling the silence. Junpei's eyes widened as he realized what was happening. Katrina apologized for having restrained him but assured him that she would release him soon. Junpei gritted his teeth, then let out a short laugh, remarking that she seemed far too pleased with herself. He asked what she intended to do to him. Katrina's smile remained as she reminded him of what she had said earlier, about the village's lack of protein. Junpei's expression hardened. She reached for the butcher's knife, explaining that they would now depend on him to provide that missing nourishment. Whether it was his seed or his flesh, she said, nothing from him would go to waste. She added that they would take care of him for the rest of his life. A flicker of fear crossed his face. Then she continued, saying that they would begin with his legs. While one was regenerating, they could take the other. The words from his earlier appraisal echoed in his mind, turning them into food. He realized grimly that it had not been an exaggeration. Katrina explained that since this place was within a safe zone, even if he lost all 4 limbs, his body would regenerate. As long as they had him, the villagers would always have a source of fresh meat. With a chilling casualness, she added that now that he had arrived, they no longer needed the weaker men for reproduction. Those men would instead be carved into food, and the elderly would be granted release from their suffering. Without a hint of hesitation, Katrina brought the butcher knife down onto Junpei's leg. A burst of agony tore through him as blood splattered across the floor. She smiled sweetly, saying how happy she was to have such a young and strong husband. Then she raised the blade again and struck his leg once more, his cries of pain echoing through the dark chamber. Katrina spoke softly, her tone almost tender as she told him that it must be painful. She apologized, asking him to endure it for a little longer. There simply wasn't enough monster meat to feed everyone, she explained, leaving them with no other choice. When she finished her work, she cheerfully announced that she was done and that they would hold a banquet to celebrate his arrival. Smiling brightly, she said she would make a delicious soup using what she had taken. Katrina told him that his legs would regenerate in about 10 days. Since one had already been cut off, she decided to free his hands, assuring him that escape would be impossible with only one leg. She wanted, she said, to take good care of her dear husband. Junpei did not respond. He simply stared at her in silence. Katrina then added that after the banquet, they could enjoy the night together. Though she had never given birth before, she claimed she had plenty of experience with the act itself. She encouraged him to relax, to entrust his body to her, promising that she would give him the best night of his life. With that, she removed the restraints from his wrists and announced that she would be leaving for now. Junpei gave her a sharp, piercing look. For a brief moment, Katrina's eyes seemed empty, her cheerful expression fading into something hollow. She told him quietly that they all knew their actions would be considered unforgivable in the outside world. But they did not expect him to forgive them. She only wanted him to understand that this was the only way they could survive. Junpei continued to stare at her, unmoving, as fragments of his past struggles replayed in his mind, his countless fights, his desperate survival, his will to endure. Katrina smiled faintly and repeated that she was truly sorry, hoping that somehow they could get along. He said nothing. Inwardly, he thought that all of them were broken in their own way. Their minds were twisted, warped by despair, yet he could understand the logic that bound their madness. In the face of hopelessness, they had simply chosen a path that allowed them to live. From their perspective, perhaps it was the only option left. If he had been born in such circumstances, he wondered if he might have done the same. Maybe, he thought, there was still a faint chance that they could understand one another. Before turning to leave, Katrina said softly that she would see him later. Junpei called out to her, beginning to say something about his flesh, but the words caught in his throat. He saw her gazing at his wounded leg, her eyes half-lidded with hunger, a thin line of drool glistening at the corner of her mouth. His brows drew together in disgust and disbelief. Katrina turned to him again, her tone returning to its sweet, domestic calm as she asked what was wrong, dear. Junpei lowered his gaze and replied quietly that it was nothing. She had wanted him to understand. This was their only way to survive. That was why she apologized and said she hoped they could get along. Junpei remembered Katrina's words as he sat alone in the dim room. Half a day had passed since she had left, and no one had come to see him. The silence pressed heavily against him, so he turned his attention to the books scattered across the room. The titles mentioned goblins, ogres, and slimes. As he skimmed the pages, he realized these were records, breeding logs. It seemed the villagers had been trying to domesticate monsters. The books detailed the ecology of the creatures, but every experiment, every attempt at breeding, had failed. Junpei wondered if there were still any breeding facilities nearby. If there were, then some of the villagers must have possessed the skills needed to manage them. And if the data written in these logs were true, he thought, then these creatures could potentially be used as weapons. He rose from the chair, leaning on a stick to support his weight, and muttered to himself that it was time to see what had become of the villagers. Enough time had passed. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he hobbled toward the staircase. Each step was an effort. When he finally reached the doorway and stepped into the hall, his eyes fell upon a body sprawled on the floor, a dead man. Then he looked around and saw more. The entire dining hall was littered with corpses, the villagers lying lifeless where they had fallen. Junpei smirked to himself. It was exactly as he had expected. Then a faint voice broke the silence, a soft, trembling "Hey, dear." Junpei turned and saw Katrina lying on the ground. She was still alive. Barely. He asked if she had survived because she hadn't eaten much. Katrina weakly explained that she had been cooking, so she had eaten very little of the poisoned meat. Junpei said nothing for a moment. Then Katrina, her voice barely audible, asked if he had poisoned his own flesh. How could he have done that? Junpei told her she was mistaken. His body itself was poisonous. Every part of him was infused with a deadly toxin, so lethal it could incapacitate even mythological creatures. A single bite, he said, would be enough to kill a normal human. Using him as a source of meat had been their fatal mistake. Katrina clenched her teeth, her face twisting between pain and disbelief. Then she let out a weak laugh. She asked why this had to happen to them. They had endured so much, struggled desperately just to keep living, and this was their reward. Junpei remained silent, listening. Despite everything, a flicker of pity stirred within him. Katrina's eyes grew distant as she went on, wondering aloud if it was because they had resorted to eating human flesh. Was this divine punishment? Was cannibalism such a terrible sin that it warranted such an end? Junpei knelt beside her, his expression unreadable. He told her she was wrong again. There were no consequences for eating humans, he said quietly. Then, his tone sharpened. Perhaps it was presumptuous of him to say so, but the truth was simple. The reason they all perished wasn't because of sin or divine punishment. It was because they were too weak. Katrina's eyes widened in shock at his words. Junpei continued, saying that was the only explanation that made sense. Still, he admitted he had learned much from her. Katrina looked at him, her gaze unsteady yet calm. She murmured that she understood now. Even someone as ignorant of the outside world as she could grasp that truth. Then, softly, she called him, dear, one last time. Her body went still. Her lips trembled with her final whisper, an apology. And then, she stopped breathing. Junpei clenched his jaw tightly. He looked down at her motionless body and muttered that it was enough, that she could finally rest. Then, in a low voice, he said, "Good job, Katrina." Junpei gently placed his hand on Katrina's head. Then he turned away from her body and walked toward one of the fallen villagers. Kneeling beside the corpse, he pressed his palm against it and murmured quietly, "Butcher, activate." A faint glow shimmered, and a skill card materialized before him. Junpei glanced at it briefly, then muttered under his breath, "No." He moved to the next body and activated the skill again. Another card appeared, again not the one he wanted. He continued, going from corpse to corpse, invoking the same command over and over. The ground became littered with cards, hundreds of them, scattered across the floor like fallen leaves. Yet none were what he sought. His expression hardened, his patience wearing thin. Then, at last, one card drew his attention. He picked it up and stared at it closely. Skill card, Monster Tame. Item rank, Beginner. A grin spread across his face. Bingo, he whispered. All that remained now was to find the right monster. Junpei limped through the corridors until he reached another room. He stepped inside carefully, his eyes sharp and alert, scanning every shadowed corner. The air was still. He muttered quietly to himself, asking where it was, where the creature might be hiding. Something glinted in the dim light, catching his attention. Against the far wall sat a large jar, sealed tightly. Junpei walked toward it and crouched down. "Found it," he said. He removed the lid, revealing a translucent mass of pure slime. The creature quivered faintly inside the container. Junpei's mouth curved into a wide smile. The contents were perfectly preserved, no contamination, no decay. He thought to himself that they were just like him. The weakest of all life forms, yet for that very reason, capable of the greatest evolution. He would turn these slimes into lethal weapons, unassuming, underestimated, unstoppable. Junpei whispered, "Box." A glowing cube appeared in the air before him, shimmering faintly. He ordered the slimes to enter it, and the gelatinous forms obediently flowed inside. Watching them vanish into the storage box, he smirked. Once his leg had fully regenerated and he finished preparing his next experiments, he told himself, he would leave this place. A glowing window appeared before his eyes. Takeda Junpei. Level 638. He stared at it in silence. He understood now. To survive in this twisted dungeon, he would have to become just as twisted. He vowed to prove that he could live, no matter how warped the world around him became. With that thought, Junpei turned and began walking again, resuming his descent into the dark unknown. One final idea echoed through his mind, cold and certain, and then, I have to kill them. Meanwhile, far away at the god's headquarters, Hidari watched through the divine mirror with a grin. At last, he said to himself, he's matured enough to be interesting. He turned to the goddess Jenny and asked how she felt after meeting Junpei. She replied softly that she didn't know, but that he reminded her of Hidari himself. Hidari burst into loud laughter. "What the hell is she saying?" he exclaimed, still laughing. Geez, but I like it. Jenny said nothing more. Her expression hardened, her gaze turning sharp. Then Hidari's voice rang out like thunder, commanding the heavens themselves. Now, set forth. Continue your search within this dark and grisly dungeon of pure madness. And within his thoughts, a whisper followed, one meant only for Junpei. Entertain me more. Takeda Junpei-kun,